curtain presentation, but I hope you aren't too terribly disappointed if we just do a recap overall history of the community. We will highlight some of the businesses that are on the curtain. Part of what I was going to try to do this time is deal with, in 1906, there was a fire that wiped out this business block that you see here. And so, primarily I'll just start and go through some of the history of the community itself and how the community acquired its name. And we'll deal with it that way. Then if there's any questions that you have, we'll do a little roundhouse question.
Can you stay in the picture frame, please?
No, no.
I'm going to have to follow you around with it then.
That would be good. And so, if you haven't seen a copy of this is the new books that are available, I would say to you that you would enjoy the reading in these. And I'm going to read a couple of segments out of this tonight, just because I thought it was just as easy to turn to the page and read what we had put in the book as it was for me to scribble it on a post or a card. And also, then that way, if I occasionally should reference to you, you can read more about it in here. There's a lot of history in here. It'll fill in a lot of the blanks for you. I know a lot of you have the original copies of these books, but I would say to you, you're missing much if you didn't get the updated edition, because there's a lot more pictures and everything else that is in the book this time. I want to open with going to page 8 of this book, this exceptionally good book.
Is there going to be a test?
There will be a test after. And say to you, a history of Depauville. Depauville is settled in a hollow where several trees and hills tumble together, where the nestling place of the pleasant little hamlet of Depauville. Nature made this spot unusually beautiful and extremely productive. The hills were densely clad with maple, elm, beech, oak, and walnut. A shining stream with abrupt curves and tumbling waterfall wended its way peacefully among the hills. It was and still is a region of great scenic beauty. The splendor of the sunsets, bathed in red and gold, and the flaming yellow of the sunrise can scarcely be matched anywhere. Isn't that so wonderfully picturesque? It sort of behooves you to think, what block did they drive around at that time? But anyway, so Depauville was a settlement that was occupied by the Indians of the Iroquois Confederacy, which basically encompassed the Iroquois Indian tribe and the Oneida tribes. The roads were that we function from today, a lot of them, were their trading trails. And the road that goes primarily that started in Brownville, comes down to Depauville, we would call the Depauville-Brownville Road, through Depauville into Clayton Center, through Clayton Center, and ended up in French Creek, was an illegal smuggling trade route. And so basically, that is how Depauville became what it is, were all the trade routes, the Indian trade routes. It was a shortcut for the Indians to canoe from the river to the lake. It was also a shortcut for the early settlers to go directly from the lake to the river, or the river to the lake, instead of having to go out and around, making it a longer jaunt for them to go by boat that way. So, one of the first things that was illegally smuggled out of here, besides the lumber, was potash, which I still don't quite understand the concept of it, but potash was formed from burnt ashes, from the burning of the wood, and it was actually a form of currency early. So, the Depauville family were a very predominant French family, along with the Lorrays. They fled France as a result of the French Revolution, when the primary monarchy of France was falling, and the big names, the wealthy families, had to get out of France. They were being executed, off with their heads. So they bought large tracts of land here. Depauville never resided here. He bought property in the north and one of his daughters married, and they lived on that property in St. Lawrence County. But they did not move here. Depauville himself was basically, you could call him an import merchant in New York City. And so he bought the tract of land, he speculated on the land, and of course that profited him well. But these families came over to carve out a new empire in the forest of the area. Depauville had 5 daughters, and our streets are named after Francis Depauville's daughters. There's Amelia, Sylvia, Eliza, Stephanie, and Caroline. Amelia married a Fowler from up north. They bought a huge tract. Fowler Sr., Theodosius Fowler Sr., bought 36,000 acres in St. Lawrence County for the couple as a wedding gift. And Francis Depauville, not to be outdone by the wedding gift, promptly built them a huge mansion on Sylvia Lake up there. And that is basically the only family that came into and lived. It would be Amelia, his daughter. The mansion was built at a cost of $17,000 in 1829. Okay, now this area originally was known as Catfish Falls. And it retained that name until 1827. And by that time, Depauville had purchased large tracts of land. He was handing out money for settlement. He was giving out money for the building of the churches and schools. And so, as its main proprietor, the name was changed to Depauville. And of course, the Catfish Falls was situated at the head of navigation on the scenic Chaumont River. And above the falls was traditionally known as Depauville Creek, or Creek, depending on where the country you may from. Some of the early settlers to come to the area, one of them would have been the Johnsons that were instrumental in developing the area. The Solomon Johnson family, who himself was postmaster from 1825 to 1827, helped settle the area, carving out mills and stuff. Stephen, a descendant, built the first stone wheel mills for grain, which required water power. So therefore, if you need water power for the stone mills instead of the upright pounding pedestal type, they had to build the dam to retain the water. And that was built in 1824. At that time, they built the stone store that still stands in the downtown business block, if you want to refer to it as the business block. So Mr. Johnson and a Mr. Waffle built a schooner in 1847 that was, this is amazing, 85 foot long and had a 16-foot beam. It was known as the S.P. Johnson, and she would ply the river, the Chaumont River, to the lake, bringing goods and commodities in and stuff out. 85 foot. And that, I would have thought an 8-foot outboard is still making this thing. The Nortons,
Yes.
Nathaniel, came from Russia, New York. In 1816, he cleared and settled the farm, and in 1823, they built the stone house that stands to the north of the village. And that primarily, for a long time, was the Norton tract, the Norton farm. Fowlers, Anson and Maria Fowler, came in 1820. The house that they built, carved out, and their property all stood where Carl Fry implement would have stand today, or KMR tire is. And the house that they built, Isla Trovan still resides in at the base of the hill. They ran a dry goods store. At this time, at about approximately that time, wood ash, potash, and grain were accepted as cash for barter in business. And they had a fantastic operation going here. You should read more about it on pages 13 and 14. It really was amazing, the transactions that they did. Their daughter Nettie married Cyrus McCormick, the inventor of the reaper. And there is a plaque to commemorate the family in the Clayton Methodist Church. Also, when the Methodist Church here was built, Nettie McCormick put a bell in the tower in memory of the family. About 1840, the German pioneers came. Then we begin to get familiar with some of the names that we really know. The German pioneers, the German settlers were poor in pocket, stout of heart, and strong of arm. Names like Dorr, Hawes, Holler, Sternberg, Wetterhahn, and Snobber all come into play at about this time. Heinrich Hawes, I found this interesting, kept a diary of his trip across the ocean, right from their auctioning the horse and the carriage at the port of departure, the 2 months that they're crossing at sea, the birth of a baby, the burial of 2 children at sea, and the finding of a stowaway child that his father had to sell their clothing and other belongings to pay for his trip. The child did not belong to the Hawes family, but Heinrich, or Henry, was a professor of music, and he brought his piano with him from Europe, from Germany. He brought an onboard boat and played and entertained the people during meals. His piano was the first in the German settlement in Jefferson County. In 1867, the Depauville Steamboat Company was organized to carry both freight and passengers, and in 1868 they built the M.W. Wright, a vessel that was commanded by the notorious Captain Gillette, who was painfully positive personality with an irritable disposition. And due to delays by the authorities at the Chameau end, when they got there, they often would have to wait for the authorities to lift the drawbridge so he could get the steamer through. And because of it, he became totally irritated and agitated one day and decided to ram the drawbridge. He destroyed the drawbridge, he destroyed the steamer, and was promptly fired. The company didn't last long, needless to say, but and there was never really the demand for the trade of the steamer. I want to hit a couple other. The Old Stone Church was completed in 1835. It started as the Depauville Union Society. It's the earliest known group that occupied it after its completion was the Free Communion Baptist that was formed by the Dodge family from Lowville at the Elm Flat Settlement, which is up to the north of us. In 1820, they started their Free Communion Baptist, and in 1821 they erected a log church. It was the first church in the town of Clayton. The cemetery, if you happen to catch it in the right light, you can still see the cemetery out behind the, most of us would call it Proven Farm, or the Snobber Farm, Snobber's Corner, or, Anyway, back to the Old Stone Church itself, it was built completed in 1835, and when Lincoln was assassinated, they had a funeral service there and draped the church in black. In 1942, lightning struck the church steeple and caused considerable damage to the steeple and the church. When we wrote the first book, I was disheartened by this. When we wrote the first book, in the close of that book, we put that the doors of this church remain open to people of all faiths. Sitting here today, I have to say that the doors of this house of worship are no longer open to any faith or available for people to attend. In 1964, the Supreme Court deeded the property to the Pentecostal Assembly. And the church has been active and an active part of the community history, but it is no longer available for attendance. The Methodist Church, the Methodist Society was formed in 1821. It's one of the first 23 chapters in Jefferson County. In 1823, the first frame church for the Methodist Society was built behind the stone schoolhouse where Brunel Ketney lives today. In 1851, they built the present structure that stands today from property donated by Gaylord Ennis, who in 1825 built this brick house that still stands up there. We would call it the, well, a lot of people know it as the Holiday House. Charlie, I forgot his last name. Lyman, that he owned it in the latter years. And later on, in 1886, what they call the Wellesley Room, the Sunday school rooms were added to the front with a new entry was put on it. And then at that time, in 1886, the first ice cream festival was held with homemade ice cream, cakes, and strawberries. And we still attend those today. In 1950, the Methodist Church was united with the Lafargeville Church, and the two were yoked together to share their minister. I found that ironic that the Methodist Church has also closed its doors, no longer in function today. In 1964, the new addition of the fellowship hall with a kitchen and pastor study and it was all added onto the back of the church. Schools. Oh, and by the way, upstairs in the bookcase is a model of the church that was donated to the library. Also of the Methodist Church, there's also a larger model. I'm not even sure where that is.
It's in the third and fourth grade class.
Okay. There's also a model of the old stone church that somebody, a wonderful soul, made with her own hands and did the interior of it also. And there also up there is a model of the stone schoolhouse and what we would refer as the Gonset, the McCormick block, or McFarland block, which no longer stands today. But the models are up there if you want to reference it on your way up and out. And we'll go back to schools. The first school was a crude kind of assembly that was built to the side one of the taverns in town. So that must have been a very good education. But then finally, sometime in the 1820s, the first story of what was known affectionately as Depauville Hillside Academy was built, and that is the present structure of the school that stands today. The second story was added in approximately 1870. This school, this historic stone schoolhouse, ran until about 1943. At that time, the Depauville School District Number 6 merged with Clayton Central School, and they built this building that we're in. And this red brick schoolhouse was then functional, and they started having classes here for the first 6 grades only, and then you were trucked off to Clayton for the rest. This building was, well, it's off and on. It was in use as a school until I think sometime in the 70s, and closed briefly, maybe in the 60s. And then closed briefly, but reopened again, and they trucked a couple of grades down here for a while. Finally, the town of Clayton acquired the building to use it as the library and the hall, community hall, and so. And a couple of the businesses here. One of them that I referenced that the model is upstairs. Those models were handmade by a railroad modeler that was an acquaintance or friend of a gal that grew up in the community, and she does marvelous artwork. And so as they had projects where she lived, she would do the artwork for their projects, and then she would show him places that she remembered growing up, and he would make the model for her. And she recently decided that, except for her own house, she decided to keep the one of her own home, that they needed to be someplace besides in her collection. So the Gonset block, most of us would recognize it as the McFarland block, was built in approximately 1870 and ran under various owners until 1968. In 1906, the Oddfellows rented the upstairs of the building, and during the course of its history, it was rented to such as H.D. Jones. In 1921, it was the Huxmar store. It later became H. Joel's store, and finally, the McFarlands acquired the building and ran it until its closure. And growing up here, the McFarlands were wonderful people to have as neighbors. You could go torment them, sit in the store window, read their comic books that they were trying to sell. You know, it was, you could go out telling that your mother had sent you for a slice of bread. And he would argue the point and say, now there's 5 of you in the family, I think Mom needs more than a slice of bread. And I said, well, if she doesn't want more than a slice, I'm bringing the rest of it back. But anyway, the A.D. Lau store, originally constructed in about 1877, was ran for years as Terry and Lau. That building, you can see in the picture here, came down with the fire in 1906. On page 48 of this wonderful book that you can read more about it, this is a business card that was available. An 1884 card, now a collector's item, advertising the Terry and Lau store, reads, winter and spring goods will be sold at very low prices to suit the times. We cannot give away all our goods, but will sell them at prices which will enable our customers as well as ourselves to live. And then the card goes on to list the dry goods: groceries, underwear, crockery, boots, shoes, jewelry, hats, capes, drugs, patent medicines, stationery, books, and numerous other available items at the store. Mr. Lau, A.D. Lau, also ran the post office for years in his store. He was one of the longest running postmen to retain the post office in his store. That was a common practice in history then, is if you happen to be a store owner, especially, you would acquire the position with the politics of the time, and then you would move the post office into your store. And so, as you read through this with the numerous postmasters, you can see where it would go from, like when Terry, this was Terry and Lau here. Well, Terry eventually bought the Stone store across the road that stands today. And when there was a battle for a little bit there between A.D. Lau and Terry as to who was going to be the postmaster and who was the politics of the time. And so it went back and forth for a little bit, but that was the way that it went at that time. It just played out as to who had the store, or whose politics were right to have the post office. So Mr. Lau ran the store and the post office until the building burned in 1906. He did not rebuild after that fire in 1906. He did rent the upstairs of his building to the Oddfellow Lodge until that fire, and then of course they went across the road to the Gonset block, which was the big gray building that just very recently is burnt in our history. And they rented the upstairs of that building, but they couldn't do that until after there was some repair done to that building, because it also was severely damaged by fire from that same fire. H.G. Jones store and the Masonic Hall were part of the fire of 1906. That building was rebuilt by the Masonic Lodge, and they rented the downstairs to H.G. Jones. Actually, they sold it. He owned the building. up to the rafters of the rafters that were the floor joists to the second floor. And he had to repair half of the roof, had to repair and maintain half of the roof of the building. But anyway, so having said that, they rebuilt their building, the Masonic Temple, there, and he rented the bottom part for a general store. And they had their upstairs for their lodge or their hall, as well as the Eastern Stars, which is the women counterpart of their organization. And then in 1927, even though he was still running the store, I found this, Corey, thank you for the tip. He became an agent for the New York Life Insurance Company, and he did that until 1952. So, many of the businessmen of the area, as some of them were businessmen, some were just store owners, some of them were proprietors of other, not just store owners, but some of them were just predominant men of the community, served as postmen, town clerks, justice of the peace. A.B. Lau served as an assemblyman to the district for, I think it was 3 terms. So there's been many of them served school boards and other positions, but anyway, your community, at one point in its history, served itself well outside of itself too. Easton Brothers Garage, which isn't in this picture at all, but it's over across from the store and gas station, which was Easton Brothers Garage, ran for years. Then Pearl Diefendorf ran a bottling company out of it. They had chocolate and orange drink. I'm not sure why just the two, but it was known as Devo Drinks. And then during the war years, it was a poultry industry. The building's been a little bit of everything. It originated as a cheese factory. In 1945, Carl Fry bought it and continued to use the garage part for his implement business. And then it currently is I believe he's still selling tires on it. It's the KMR tire building. But it started as a cheese factory on that site. A recap of where we are at this point. In 1878, that's been like 130 years ago, roughly calculated, you would be at about the peak of Depauville's, not popularity, but her thriving. You had 4 stores of general mercantile. You had 2 churches, a good school, the gristmill, the sawmill, 2 hotels that were doing very well, a post office, a telephone office, a butter and cheese factory, 3 blacksmith wagon shops, 3 millinery stores, and a tailor shop, 2 shoe stores, 2 resident ministers, 2 resident physicians, 2 resident dentist, and 2 justice of the peace. And then we're serving a community of approximately 400 plus people. That does not include your population of farmers that were outside that really relied on having the community to come to. What is the major decline? 2 major events. The first thing you would have to hit on are the 2 fires, that were the biggest things. On April 30th of 1906, the business section started in the Charles Door store, which was the bottom of the Masonic Hall. He was running the store then. Shortly after closing the store, the fire was discovered in the main floor of the building. And of course, everything was a bucket brigade then. And so the building that was where the gazebo stands today was where the fire started. It then went to the A.D. Lau store, which is where Leona Wilkie still operates her business after 60 years on the same street corner. And it went to the A.D. Lau store, then to the gristmill, which was run by Byron Fox, which was this building, the large building. It then took in the Bloom and Reinhold Hotel, which stood where the present hotel stands. It severely damaged a dwelling that was known as where the Weatherhound House is today, and the Gonset store, which was across where we just lost the building. That was severely damaged. Most A.D. Lau did not rebuild. Fox family, this structure, they owned the property across the little road here that had a barn on it. And they took the barn from that small property and just literally dragged it around and stuck it on the remaining section. They didn't need, at that point, electricity was becoming available. They didn't need the water power the same way. They did not even bring it to the wheel power to that mill at that time. The Masonic Lodge rebuilt their building, the hotel rebuilt its building, and but basically that fire they sort of rebuilt from, but it was a setback. Then the fire in 1921, which started on the roof of the cheese factory, that is KMR Tire, and was run by the John Martin Company, and it went from the cheese factory to the then town hall, which stands where we would have called it the Drew House. If we're growing up here, it's across the road. The town hall stood there. And from there, it took in the Grabber Hotel, which was a huge presence of a building where the groceries, or the quick stop and gas station stands today. It then took in dwellings, homes. C.J. Whittier's house stood on the corner, down by, right on the very corner by the light. It took in the Charles Brown house, the Myra Dwyer house, the William Upton house, the Sherman Holiday house, and the H.D. Adams house, and all of these are with contents. They saved two homes by dragging mattresses out of their homes, throwing them on the roof, and soaking them with water. Those homes were relatively small structures. One home that did escape it is, growing up, it was Jack Fachette's house. It's behind the store now. It did not sit there. It sat over on a foundation closer on the other side of where the store and gas station is, closer to the creek bank. And then when the fire went through, they just picked the little building up, that house, and dragged it around and stuck it on the foundation. But there was only a couple homes that were saved. They also lost 6 barns and 2 cows that were owned by Howard Lee. In this fire, they called for assistance from, and some of you know this story, they called for assistance from Watertown because the fire was so severe, and they also called Clayton's ladder team, or hose team. Clayton isn't that far away, but they ran out of gas a mile out of town. And even though they sent word to please get the hose off the truck and bring it down, there was contention between who was going to boss who around with the fire equipment, and they sat a mile out of town, and Watertown actually ended up getting here to assist in fighting that fire before Clayton got in town. But, you know, be that as it may, it's just a little footnote to everything that... And of course, in that fire, homes were rebuilt. The cheese factory was rebuilt. The town hall that we now would call, I call it the Big Gray Elephant, in the middle of on the island down there. That became the new town hall. They did not rebuild the old one. They built that one, and in 22, that was available for use. It had a stage. The stage needed a curtain. Hence, this curtain was painted, and the space was sold to pay for the painting of this picture, which the town hall stands here. So this scene was a scene of what was before the town hall was built in that space. And these were advertisement spaces for businesses that were currently operating. And as you can see, they went outside of town with some of them. Fallers was a great restaurant in Clayton. that served tremendous home cooked meals. And you got Otis Brooks Lumberyard. E.J. Eckert was an in-town operator. He ran the Stone Store for years, probably one of the best known proprietors of the Stone Store to this day. Everybody that was in town at that time that did Eckert, or business with Eckert, is well familiar with him. It was Eckert and Huxmeyer for a while, but then Huxmeyer sold out to run a business on the other side of the street, and it became strictly E.J. Eckert General Store. We've got H.G. Jones, who bought advertisement space. Lincoln Felter Hay, when the steamboat enterprise failed, the only other thing that shipped out of here for a while was the Little Mac, was a little tub, and they shipped hay down to, and they also took the baseball team down and out and around to play ball games on occasion, so little excursions that way. Sternberg Brothers Advertising in here, they had the General Trucking, which is in the building that, well, we would have called it the post office and Compost General Store for years and years. It stands on the corner. Teresa is clipping hair down there now. They had that building. They also ran the post office out of there and a hardware store. But in their time, Sternberg Brothers, Sternberg's father, had the sawmill in town, which stands here, as caught in the corner of this picture. And they also had a cheese box and freight box business that they ran very, very successfully. Matter of fact, they sold cheese boxes so that cheese during the war could be shipped to England, because England was in dire need of something to eat in the line of protein. And so they did very well, but then post World War II, things changed. Business dropped off, and so did the demand for their shipping business. That brings me back to after our fires, some of the things that changed the makeup of the community would be electricity, changed the demand for water power, and having the need for having the little cluster around the community. Your farming industry, even though the farmers were still, needed the community, farming was changing dramatically in that same time frame. Automobiles came along and started changing the face of where people lived and where people worked. When I grew up in this community, everybody either worked in Clayton or Watertown. It was practically just a sleeping community when I grew up here. And so those are just some of the things that really changed the face of why, when you read back through here, that you could see a community that really was such like the hub of a wheel. You were 6 miles to Chaumont, and 6 miles to Lafargeville, and 6 miles to Clayton. And so you were better centrally located for the doctors and the dentists and the people to attend to. So that also was why it held its own for a long time. With that, I just wanted to reflect a little on growing up in the community. When you grow up in a little town like this, everybody is your grandparent. Everybody is your uncle. I got my ear tweaked by more neighbors of the community for misbehaving, and walked down the street by more people. Some of them you affectionately called, like Anola. We called her Anola, but she was no relative at all, but it was good chicken soup and sandwich whenever you walked in the door. We were talking a while back, some of us in the family, you played on people's property respectfully, but yet they loved to have you there. And part of that conversation hinged around, we would spend the whole first part of a winter, when the snow came, packing a hill, so that by the time you had that first thaw, you'd end up with this ice slick that you could retain until about April 1st, it seemed like. But we would be on the hill, and most of the last few years, a lot of that time was spent on a hill that was behind Fred and Ruth Gould's house. And you know, we were loud, we were noisy, we would be out there after dark, but they didn't care. They didn't kick you off, they didn't chase you away, they would discipline you if you needed it, without hesitation. They didn't fear that your parents, if I got disciplined by somebody else and I went home, my parents didn't contest it and say, well, I'm calling them right up. They either said, well, you deserved it, or you're going to get round two because I'm embarrassed that somebody asked me. And so, anyway, the other part of it was, often with these families, they would end up, you'd be playing on a Sunday afternoon, you were about to give up because you were froze stiff, and they would call you in for fresh baked cookies and hot chocolate. And we were discussing Halloween and trick-or-treating, and of course there were certain spots, you got your costume on and you ran to the hot spots. There was one woman in town that made about 10, 12, maybe 20 candy apples, and that was all there was, so you had to be the first ones to get the candy apples. There was a woman in town that made popcorn balls, and so if you wanted the popcorn balls, you ran and you hit the hot spots, because you know, the candy was great, but it didn't hold a candle to those homemade treats, which included Mrs. Sherman, who, when you came to the Sherman residence, you had to come inside, sit down. She had made fresh donuts and had cider, but you had to sit down, take the mask off, and talk to the people if you wanted those warm donuts and fresh cider. And so it was different growing up here. It was fun. I wouldn't trade it for anything. We played in the creek, you know. My father had this idea to sell Christmas trees many years, and one year I dragged this tree up the road to a house, and it was just the man's nature to see if he couldn't rattle you. And he said, pick out the best tree, I don't care, just bring me the best tree you think you got. So I dragged the tree up the road on the sled, I get it there and I stand it up for him, and he says, you call that a tree? It isn't straight, it isn't full, it isn't. And I just blew it and I put it back on the sled and went down the road with it, and he promptly followed me down and bought the same tree. But anyway, it was a fun place to grow up, and it was a different time. You didn't really worry about, I don't think the people worried about, although we got kicked out of a few yards for throwing the apples, but anyway. People didn't worry about you being on their property and that they were going to get sued if you fell down. And you didn't, you know, they didn't worry about you being there playing, and you didn't have to worry about getting kicked off or whatever. But you also tried to behave a little different than, you know, I don't think we ever did anything. Well, one time I'll share this one too. One time they had some event at the Masonic Hall, and we went around and took all the gas caps off the automobiles and put them in a bag, only to discover that then we couldn't match gas caps back to all the automobiles. So that one was a really stupid stunt to pull. But anyway, having said that, I guess that
How long before you could sit?
It was a while. It was a while. But having said that, it just was a great community to grow up in. It was a bit of a retirement community, so you had a lot of the grandparent type in the community that seemed to, when they took you in to help to kind of watch over you, they also taught you. It was a different situation than it is today, and I'm glad to have grown up here. No matter where I end up or where I roam at this point, there's a fondness for this community. There was always something to do. We didn't have a TV. Our first TV when we moved here, it was as big as the washing machine, and the screen was about as big as this book. We got 2 whole channels, and they were in black and white with this stuff that fuzzed across the picture at one time. And it was much later until we got a 19-inch black and white television, and we thought we were in TV heaven, and we got 3 channels then. But that didn't seem to matter because I don't ever really remember being obsessed with the television or the video games or anything else because you were outside constantly. You were just outside doing, and that you were on the hill playing, you were in the creek catching minnows and crayfish, or or whatever the deal was. You were just loose on the streets. We were a little bit of a terror, but that wasn't always easy either because there was a couple of women that would sit in their houses in the dark and they would recognize your walk when they went by. And if you were out after dark and doing something wrong, they would call your parents right up. And Depauville wasn't that big, and before I could get home, my mother already knew what I was up to. And when I walked in the door, she'd be standing there. And of course, Mom's initials are L-A-W, which is the law. And it was in our home. So, but anyway, if anybody's got any questions or would like to discuss anything, I'll open it up at this time for a little bit of free comments. Anybody that grew up here that would like to reminisce. I just felt that the first time out, we pounded history and dates down your throat, and that's okay, but it's not fun. And the books, are we still selling these at 15 or? Okay, at 15. And then the other time we hit most of the high points on the curtain. And so anyway, I just wanted to shake it up a little so it's not all the same thing all the time. So if anybody's got any recollecting they'd like to do that grew up here, I would open the floor to you for a little bit. Or if you've got any questions concerning anything that I can hopefully answer. You can see one last thing in the photo or in the painting here. There are quite a few of the buildings that are still distinguishable. This building is now gone, but growing up we played in that too. The Methodist Church, and I believe there's some contention whether this is back of Gladys Door's house, or whether it was part of the Anthony Grabber property that was over on the main road.
Is that where the jail was?
The jail was in the old town hall that burned.
Oh,
That would be where Levy DeRue's house is.
oh, okay.
And of course, that's Old Stone Church. And some of these structures are on the street, and then this one, I believe, is supposed to be the schoolhouse. But some of it's a little hard to pick some of it off from it. This, I believe, is the corner of the McFarland building that recently burned. This was a shed that was part of this property. And the stone store had a millinery shop and everything attached to it, and I believe that these are the extended sheds that were attached to that building at that time.
Do you know anything about the painter? The signature?
Still didn't, it says photo by Depauville, but I don't believe that's the painter. I think that this photo by S.A. Depauville is because, well, actually, yeah.
It's that.
It is this photo that's on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And so I think what they're doing is ending up crediting his original photo work that was taken when they did this. Because I couldn't get any answers to it before, but I don't believe that's the painter, artist.
But he charged so much money that they had to get all that advertising.
But whoever did this, I think probably between the purchase of the curtain, probably, and everything, and also in its time there, this curtain where it stood, there was a couple of wings to the side of the stage, and there was two different scenes of some said, I know one was on the Lower Creek because I think I could almost walk to it, and then I think the other one was supposed to be Up Creek. So, but I did find out that this Purity Ice Cream is still in business, by the way. It is still functioning. That was the question we had the last time that I didn't have an answer to. So.
Yeah, do you know where they are?
It's a East Coast ice cream firm, but they do sell in and around the area, so. But
What's the fabric that is painted on?
it's a duck kind of canvas-like fabric. And when you get up, if you haven't already been around the back of it, it is interesting that most any production that was ever put on, while this curtain stood, the people wrote the name of the play they put on, and there's many an autograph back there. of people that were in the productions and signed their names to it. So, we have a descendant of C.A. Plumpton sitting in the house tonight. Hi, Nancy.
Yeah, that's me. That was my grandfather. And I never met him. The only time I met somebody that knew him was, there used to be a Mr. Steele that had a gun shop on the corner of Clayton.
Ozzie Steele.
Yeah, okay. And I went in and he said, well, are you from around here? And I said, no, my grandfather was. And he said, oh, you're chunky just like he was. That's the only thing I heard.
I happened to look up his name in the library in Clayton, and he died young.
Yeah,
Yeah. And of course, he originally ran where Cliff Good had the store where now the Porch and Paddle store is.
yeah.
And then Cliff Good took it over, and Mr. Plumpton went to Watertown, but he didn't live to be, I don't think he was 50 years old.
I'd have to look it up. I read his death certificate at the house where I came,
Yeah,
but I never knew him and I was born in '47.
yeah.
So I know he was dead before then. But my uncles and my aunt ran the Plumpton Chevy up there
Yeah.
for a while, yeah. So, but that's all I know about him. And I have just come across some pictures, some of my cousins are sending me photos I have a photo of the old garage when it was the garage and a company picnic and some postcards from Depauville, but I didn't bring them, sorry.
Marcus?
Down at the museum, people are bringing in postcards. We just came up on a postcard. Nobody knew what it was, but it was Depauville taken from the top of the hill. And you could see the cheese factory and the church steeples, but it was all dirt road.
Mm.
It was quite an old picture.
From the old hill? The one that went
Yeah,
down
the old
road?
hill, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it was Depauville, yeah.
Yeah.
So down there in the museum library.
When I grew up, Marcus and Ed Sternberg were still running their business down there, and Marcus was quite a talker. He used to like to tell stories. And one of the things that he was telling is that his father always maintained that when they had the team of horses skidding lumber out of the woods for the sawmill, that if they had 2 inches of ice and kept horses in motion, they would cross them on the water. And I'm thinking 2 inches of ice in a team of horses with a skid of logs. I want to be in motion, all right? And they nicknamed him Sammy, and I asked him one time where the Sammy came from, and a circus came to town one year, and he agreed to wash the elephants while the circus was in town, and he was nicknamed Sammy as a result of washing the elephants with the circus.
Dean, I remember back in the 50s, coming from Lafargeville over to Depauville, and there was a tiny gas station, I think where the convenience store is.
Yeah.
And then there was a tiny gas station up where Hawes's house was.
Yes.
Who owned those?
Well,
Or did they change hands frequently?
that might be part of it.
Mary Carlisle.
I was just gonna say,
On the hill, and Frank Bailey running
okay.
by Hawes's place.
And that was just a little pit stop of a gas station.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the one down below here, was a little bit bigger one, but did, I can't think who ran that now.
Well,
Ralph and Dora did
Dora.
but they didn't own it, they ran it for somebody, didn't they?
I think, Spencer.
Spencer.
But I also remember Ed and Megan the Carpenter in there too.
Oh, that's right.
They
Yeah,
had a
the
little lunch
Carpenter.
counter in there too.
Yeah.
And then wasn't there a gentleman that lived up on the hill that had lost his legs due to a
Yeah.
railroad accident?
Yeah,
Super D, Dan Carlin.
What'd you
Super
call
D,
it, Gloria?
remember that? Super D, I don't know, maybe, my brother may have done that, but that was the nickname of the family, Super D.
Okay.
Dan Sprague.
Dan Sprague.
Dan Sprague.
And he'd get around and get downtown and...
Oh, you bet.
Oh, yeah, I see him coming up and down that hill on his knees, just flying.
yeah, he had a modified cart of wheels, I guess, that he
Yeah,
put himself on because he lost his legs, and so It was kind of, my best interpretation of it would be like a mechanics creeper type thing.
Right.
And he just would get around on that, so.
No
He could really get around on it, so they tell him, so.
But there was a dentist office, in that
Dr.
little
Davis.
building
Dr.
right
Davis.
there by the hotel.
I used to go there.
Yeah.
Dr.
My mother bring me over to see Dr. Davis.
Yes,
Clyde Haller had a veterinary office here for a while,
yes.
on the corner.
Does anybody recognize the name Coon Haller?
Yeah,
Who said yup?
I do.
My father was born on the Coon Haller farm.
Philip Zangs.
That's the Zhang farm, isn't it? Yes, I'm in there. Okay, that's, you know, on his baptismal certificate, it says born on Coon Haller farm. And for years, I've chased every Haller in the country, you know, and finally George Bowes, who grew up on the Zhang farm, said, that's my farm, you
Good.
know? Cool, thank you.
Great old farm.
Grandfather's.
Well, anybody else with any comments, questions, curiosities? That's how we solve history, because I certainly didn't know that.
Well, George Schaefer, that had the meat market in Clayton, was a resident of Depauville.
Okay, no, I didn't know that before either.
I live in his house.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right, you do.
Yeah,
And,
he was supervisor of the town of Clayton.
Yeah, I did know that,
My
but I
mother
didn't,
did all his book work.
yeah, I didn't realize that he lived on this end when he had the,
Yeah, his store in Clayton where the flower shop is.
Yeah, you're right.
yeah.
Was
Keith's property?
Keith's property used for anything, or was always all? Keith Oxemeyer's property that she bought, was it always just a home, or was it ever used for anything?
Just a home, as far as I
just a
know.
home, always a home.
And the lady that donated those
Yeah.
little buildings lived there.
Yeah, the woman that I mentioned in the bookcase behind plexiglass, there's homemade models of some of the buildings in the community. She lived there and she kept her house the way it looked
The way
then.
she do it when she lived there.
But that's the woman that donated the building. She lived in the house that you're in. Only that second story that's up there wasn't part of it then, so.
Dean, I've heard of a train service that went from Watertown to Clayton. Did it come through Depauville?
No,
No,
no.
no.
Had to go to Philadelphia and then down through, Pertner to Teresa over to
Didn't
LaFarge.
come through Lafarge.
Oh, wow, okay.
Had-
Yeah.
Yeah, you
You
can't.
took
you
the
can't
train
get too
from
far.
Watertown to Augsburg, but you switched over at Rivergate,
Yeah.
which is between
Yeah,
Teresa and
there's a
LaFarge.
Rivergate prison, yeah, okay.
Okay, and you came down through Lafargeville.
Oh, my word, okay.
Ran right back my house.
And the train never ran to Alexandria Bay, they had a trolley from Redwood.
Yeah, was it Black River Trolley Company?
I don't know, but.
Well, I think the one time I read, Black River Trolley Company had a line that went to Dexter, a line that went to Alex Bay, and they actually entertained a line coming here, but they were having struggles with right-of-ways and that kind of thing, and it ended up that they just abandoned all effort to finish that project, and they didn't need their lines going around to the different places after a little bit anyway, so it just never materialized. But at one point, the Black River Trolley Company went out of Watertown to some of the outlying areas, so, but,
And somebody was telling me they used to ice skate between here and Lafargeville on the river over there, whatever you call it. Did you do that?
as a kid, I remember skating up there past what we call Kilburn's Bridge, and
Really?
yeah, you'd go until you practically ran out of water, or ran out of ice, because it
Yeah.
just.
Well, we did the same thing in French Creek,
Yeah,
went all the way to the cement bridge, then turn around and go back against the north wind.
we spent an awful lot of time on that creek, whether it was frozen or liquefied or whatever it was, we spent a lot of time on it growing up. So occasionally we come in soaking wet and stop right there, don't go any farther.
Very much so.
But
Where was Fowler's in James Street?
Norm would know better where Fowler's Restaurant was.
That's where the Lost Navigator
Okay,
and the Keogh family ran it, even though they called it Fowler's. And it was a working restaurant with a good kitchen. And my Aunt Bernice Wagner, my father's sister, she worked there as a waitress. And the bar wasn't anywhere near the predominance that bar rooms are today.
Right.
Because it was a family style restaurant. And when the war came along, I think Pop Keogh got out of it and went doing carpenter work.
Oh, very nice.
But John Keogh and Joe Keogh grew up when their family was running that restaurant. But it was Fowler's restaurant. I don't know if there was a family connection or what.
I remember seeing a menu from there one time, and they had quite a meal for the price. It was
Yeah,
a
we
great
got-
meal for the
We
price.
got copies of the menu down there at the museum. Butcher's Hardware was where the rack store is today.
Yes,
Right?
yep. Well, okay, I've occupied about as much of your time as I I think there's still some refreshments, and thank you for coming out and.
Thank you, Dean. We got money flying over here, so we're.